The studio lights burned like a confession. Cameras tightened, the live stream ticked upward, and in that charged silence Joe Rogan leaned forward and said, "Tonight we're not speculating, we have the proof." Greg Gutfeld's grin died on his face as he pushed a thick folder into the camera's frame and, with a voice that trembled between fury and pity, added, "If this is true, everything you trusted about power in California is a lie." For the next hour the world watched a slow, seismic unraveling. Documents, emails, photographs, whispers of deals made in the dark while families lost their homes, and an ordinary demand echoed through millions of living rooms: look, listen, and do not look away. It began a week earlier with a single, anonymous tip. Someone who had worked inside the corridors of Sacramento, whose hands had once moved the very paper they now wanted to burn, sent an encrypted message to Rogan's producers. At first the team treated it like dozens of other leads, a curiosity among many, but the message contained an attachment that changed everything: scanned memos with timestamps, bank transfers traced to shell companies, and notes tying private benefits to a pattern of policy favors. Joe, who built his audience on curiosity rather than partisan war, handed the files to Greg because he knew Greg could cut through the noise. Greg, a man who hid razor-sharp skepticism beneath a jokey persona, read them at midnight and called back with one sentence that stilled a room: "These aren't rumors. They're receipts." They set the show live for transparency. No pre-recorded edits, no filters, the documents on the table like a dare. The first few minutes were casual, like any late-night conversation. Jabs about politics, the state's struggles with homelessness and the erratic pattern of wildfires, the normal banter between two hosts who rarely agreed but always entertained. Then Greg reached into his bag and the tone shifted. He pulled papers, photos, and printouts toward the camera so plainly the viewers could see the ink, the dates, the signatures. The chat room filled with capital letters and disbelief. Joe's voice, usually a steady baritone, went quiet as he traced a line on one of the emails. The sender, the recipient, the subject line, an instruction to redirect funding, an approving nod from an aide whose name had previously never mattered. As Greg walked through the timeline, each piece of evidence bent the arc of the story from politics into betrayal. He read aloud emails where private developers were prioritized for state contracts, where permits were fast-tracked for favored friends, where a series of donations seemed to correspond suspiciously with policy exceptions and personal favors. "This," Greg said, "is the anatomy of how influence becomes policy at the cost of ordinary people." Joe interrupted only when the logic demanded it, asking the hard questions a viewer wanted to hear. Who knew? Who signed off? Who profited? When Greg answered, his voice was tired, as though he had carried the weight of the files into the studio and it had not yet left him. Tension mounted when a caller, a former staffer who had gone to ground for weeks, joined the line and corroborated a pattern: late-night meetings at private clubs, unrecorded conversations, and a chilling casualness about bending rules. The caller's voice broke as they described watching programs meant to help the homeless get diverted to consultants and ad firms while contracts quietly moved into private hands. The viewers began to pour in stories of their own, people's faces, their backyards, eviction notices scanned into the chat. This was no longer abstract. The screen reflected the faces of people who had lost everything while decisions were made in faded rooms at the top. At one point Joe set the folder down and stared at the camera like a man seeing a mirror of the country. "This isn't about red or blue. It's about whether anyone hears the people at the bottom," he said. Greg, who had always cultivated detachment as armor, abandoned jokes and instead asked the question that had haunted the show since the opening line: what happens when an entire system starts serving itself? The silence that followed was almost loud, an absence of denials, a vacuum where answers should have been. Then, in the most electric minute of the broadcast, the governor's office called to demand airtime to respond. For a breath, the spectacle was raw democracy, a public official poised to answer allegations live. But the call faltered, then fizzled. Words were rehearsed and then withheld. A press secretary offered a carefully curated statement rather than presence. The empty answer, a prepared script rather than a direct reply, landed like a stone in a still pond and rippled outward. The hosts looked at each other and then directly at the camera. "Silence," Joe said quietly, as sometimes the loudest answer. The fallout was immediate. Clips from the episode spread like wildfire across platforms. Protests formed outside government buildings as people who had felt invisible now held evidence in their hands. Reporters dug into the paper trail and found parallel paths: contractors whose contracts ballooned, organizations whose missions shifted overnight, families whose aid evaporated. There was anger, yes, but there was something else, a slow, galvanizing grief. Viewers were no longer spectators to politics, they were witnesses to consequences. The hosts watched as strangers called to thank them and to confess their own complicity in ignoring red flags for years. A single mother who had chronicled her eviction in tear-stained messages appeared on a clip later, speaking nakedly about the shame and relief of being seen. Resolution did not come in a single flash. Systems that grieved cannot be mended with one broadcast, no matter how explosive. Investigations were launched, and some officials were asked to resign, others were cleared, many questions remained. But something irreversible had been set in motion. The public had demanded transparency with a force it had rarely mustered. Out of the outrage, small but significant reforms began to bud: stricter oversight on certain contracts, new channels for whistleblowers, community boards given voice in decisions that affected their neighborhoods. It was messy and incomplete, like a wound beginning to scab over, not healed, but no longer ignored. Yet the deepest change was less institutional and more human. The show ended not with triumph but with an urgent plea. Joe's closing voice was quieter than his usual swagger, threaded with a rawness that made millions of viewers feel accountable. "This isn't just a scandal," he said. "It's a reminder that when we stop asking, we stop protecting. We lose a little of ourselves." Greg nodded and, for once, offered no punchline. Instead he offered a call to action that landed like a benediction. Pay attention, hold people to account, and above all, tell the stories of those who cannot be heard. By the final minute of the broadcast, the chat was full of people pledging to do more than watch, to protest, to volunteer, to vote with new knowledge. The final frames lingered on the folder left on the table, a simple object that had become a symbol of transparency. As the screen faded, the host's last words were a direct address to the viewers: if this moved you, if it made you angry or hopeful, don't keep it inside. Speak, share, hit like if you want this to matter, drop a comment so we know you're awake, and subscribe. Because silence is the thing that lets darkness live. The plea was not pandering, it was a demand for participation, and it worked. People felt stirred to act, compelled to press the buttons they'd been ignoring. In the days that followed, the story kept haunting screens and streets, not because it promised clean endings, but because it offered a raw lesson. Accountability begins when ordinary people refuse to accept polished narratives over painful truths. The program did not end a career or fix every broken policy, but it did something arguably rarer. It reminded a nation that power is not a private club and that truth, once uncovered, is a responsibility shared by everyone who sees it. That was the quiet, stubborn victory. Not a single moment of perfect justice, but a reclaimed sense that silence can be broken, and that when it is, people will finally, defiantly, demand to be heard.